Welcome to the May episode of the Industry Pulse, a monthly market update on trends in auto finance and credit quality, credit demand, residual values, regulatory compliance, macroeconomics, and more. It is my pleasure to introduce Rusty West, co-founder and president of MarketScan, who is returning for his second appearance on the Industry Pulse. Rusty, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome back to the show. We've got a bit to discuss, so I do want to jump right in.
Hey, Joey, listen, it's a pleasure. I'm always honored to join you, and your questions are typically a little bit provocative and really focused on our industry, and I'm looking forward to diving in. This will be a fun topic also.
Well, I appreciate the kind words for sure. So, the concept of the last mile has been central to the success of many emerging businesses, as well as the transformation of entire industries in recent years. In the world of automotive, data is now the last mile, enabling the consumer at the comfort of their home to pick their car of choice by selecting their preferred down payment, monthly payment, and the term of their contract. It has taken the industry decades to get to this point, and we're almost there, but not quite. Today, we're going to discuss how all stakeholders in the automotive industry, manufacturers, auto lenders, marketers, retailers, and data companies have built their own suite of technologies to facilitate modern retailing that seamlessly connects online shopping with the showroom. However, it's the complete, timely, and accurate data that is paramount to being able to serve up offerings for the consumers at home that are transactable. A complete data set which intrinsically connects each of the stakeholders correctly is critical to facilitate a transparent, frictionless, and much improved customer experience, regardless of where the customers are in their shopping journey. We're going to take a look and break down all the pertinent data points necessary to arrive at a scientifically perfect, transactable solution for the customer. So let's get into it and take a look behind the curtain at what each stakeholder vertical in the industry and examine the critical part data plays along the way. So first, I think we should start with the manufacturer class of data. The manufacturers produce the cars and use data in various forms in their promotional efforts. So let's discuss that. What level of sophistication goes into the rebates and incentive programs published each month?
Almost immeasurable, right? You look at all the manufacturers from the big three domestics all the way down to some of even the small niche manufacturers. They've got teams of people and data scientists, and they're doing all kinds of research to try and figure out how best to move the needle, right? How to buy the business for the exact right price, how to get the exact volume that they need based on inventory levels and production levels and all that stuff, which obviously are a bit of a mess right now with the with all the chip shortage and stuff that's going on. And historically, it's all been a review mirror look, which is very insightful, right? And you look at companies like Urban Science, Experian, JD Power. They do an unbelievably good job at tracking the information that's happened with the transactions, right? We know which customers have bought which cars, what they paid for them. We know how the transaction looked, what types of rebates and incentives there were and all that. But it's a review mirror look. Literally, it's like returning back to the scene of the crash to try and figure out what went wrong, right? And what we're seeing is a shift to let's look and see what's going on in the market kind of real time right now, right? And we have to take all of the information into account in order to do that, right? And that last mile that we talk about literally is all the information. So, it doesn't matter whether you're a manufacturer, a lender, a digital retailing company, a consumer, whatever. At the end of the day, what we're trying to figure out is how do we influence the consumer's behavior in a manner that makes sense for us as a business entity, regardless of the business entity. And we know now that consumers are much more payment shoppers and payment buyers than they have ever been, right? And I think a lot of that's been driven by the pandemic. And So being able to sit and look and say, okay, here's what happened. It's really important to be able to understand exactly what happened, but also to be able to say, okay, where are we in the marketplace right now? What's being presented to consumers real time every single day? And how do I make myself attractive to them, but not too attractive, right? And it's a very difficult math puzzle. It's one that a lot of companies are throwing a ton of resources at, and it's changing, it's shifting. That last mile literally is changing the way a lot of the manufacturers are starting to look at their incentive spend and their rebate spend, and even their subvention programs. How they support those for their captive lending. So.
Great. Well, I mean, let's jump into like the lender class of data. Lenders play a key role in providing financing for the consumer. So what data elements from a lender's perspective are part of the role they play in servicing the consumer and getting their share of the business?
So it's super similar to the manufacturer, right? It's looking at the same data through a different lens, if you will, right? If I'm a manufacturer, what my focus is, here's the cars that I sell, down to a very specific trim level, right? And even though we get to a particular trim level, we need to know, okay, what are the representatives of, or a fair representation of each one of those individual trim levels, meaning that, they've got certain levels of equipment, they've got certain MSRPs and that kind of stuff. And how do we compete against the equivalent competitive trim levels from the other manufacturers and all that kind of stuff, right? And we take that into consideration, and then we lump that together with all of the rates, residual values, tax policies, dealership quoting rules, all that kind of stuff, to figure out how do we position ourselves. If we look at that same mindset to a certain extent from the lending institution's lens, the variance in the MSRPs and costs and that kind of stuff aren't anywhere near as important, because relatively they're going to be the same, right? Everybody's payments are going to go up or down kind of in a linear fashion with the more expensive or less expensive widget, if you will, at that trim level. But knowing if I'm lender X and knowing what my payments are compared to the other lending institutions in the market, down to the trim level, down to the consumer demographic level, if you will, a credit score, driving habits, that kind of stuff, then it gives us insight into how do we position ourselves to be exactly where we want to be, right? I did a webinar thing a little while back, and we used the example of a Ferrari, right? So if I'm a lending institution, I come out with a program where, Joey, you can go get the brand new $400,000 Ferrari, and it costs you $1,500 up front and $250 a month, a 36-month, 12,000 mile a year lease. And the end of the 12,000 miles, 36 months, you get to walk away. I suspect tomorrow morning you're going to be at Starbucks in a $400,000 Ferrari, right? The problem is me as a lender, I'm going to go bankrupt because I paid way too much money for that business, right? And conversely, if I'm quoting you a Ferrari type payment on a new Honda Accord, you're not going to do business with me either. So the lending institutions are using all of the information necessary to figure out exactly what an actual transactable type payment is on every trim level for their programs, and all the competitors in each individual market for each demographic. And I know that if I'm $100 a month more expensive than the number one customer or lending institution that's out there on a $400 a month car, I'm not going to get that business. So I might want to move my spend around, my residual risk. I might want to take on a little bit more. I might drop my yield, lower the rate, maybe waive a bank fee or whatever to acquire that target. And then conversely, if I'm $100 a month cheaper than the next best guy, I'm paying too much for that business. So maybe I'll move $90 a month of that from that vehicle over to the one that I'm $100 a month higher, and I can get both customers for about the same spend. So basically, the goal is to spend the same amount but increase the volume, right? Or keep the volume the same and spend less, depending on the appetite. And but that's what they're doing. That's that same last mile that you talked about is what is the actual payment the consumer sees, right? And that's the hardest one to get right.
I would love to be able to drive a Ferrari for $400 a month.
Yeah, me too. The insurance is $1,000 a month, but the payment's only $400, right?
Hey, you got to take what you can get.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You look good in one, Joey.
I'm sure I would. You and I will both never see me in one, but we can dream, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so can you give me an example of how a lender is using this data differently from past years?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple, right? A lot of lending institutions, the manufacturers are starting to do this too, but a lot of lending institutions have started to adopt a different philosophy, right? Which is, it's not how they see the outside world that matters. It's how the outside world sees them, right? It's how you as a consumer on an individual transaction see them, right? Because you're probably exactly the same as almost every consumer out there, which is you really don't care what the national average monthly payment is if somebody in, Wisconsin's paying for a Honda, right? If you found a vehicle that you want, what you want to know is how much are you going to pay up front and how much are you going to spend every month for how many months and what's my financial package look like? How does it affect my family? That's the part that makes a big difference, right? And when the lending institutions are starting to look at the world from the outside world's view, it changes everything, right? And so they end up really being scientific about how we go about this, right? If we take all this information, we say, okay, I want to be $5 a month cheaper than my nearest competitor across the board on this segment of vehicles, right? This is our sweet spot. These are the vehicles and these are the demographics, the customers that we want in our portfolio. And every lending institution's focus is different, right? But we want to be positioned here, right, as opposed to down here. And in order to do that, we want to be positioned exactly here. We don't want to be $100 a month cheaper. We want to be $5 a month cheaper. How do we get there? And they'll spend a lot of there's technologies out there that'll give them that kind of focus where they can say, this is the target that I'm looking for. What switches and levers do I pull down to the individual trim level, zip code level, consumer type level in order to acquire that exact payment so I can be presented to a consumer in a manner that influences their behavior for the exact right price. And that's what we're starting to see, and it's really changing the way some of the more progressive lending institutions are going about it. So It's kind of fun.
So how is the data being used to tie in like lender operations with the retailers, OEMs, et cetera?
It's kind of all the same, but just used by different players, right? So we look at just from an overarching view, right? There's several pillars to the foundation of the automotive ecosystem, right? And the main ones are it's the manufacturers, it's the lending institutions, obviously, it's the digital retailing companies that are out there, it's the marketing companies, and the individual dealership, right? So at the end of the day, we've all got to take a look at the big picture, right? And say, okay, as a manufacturer, I want to acquire a particular target, right? And the switches and levers that I can pull in order to get that target, and that target is that monthly payment that influences Joey's behavior, right? I can change my rebates, my incentives, rates, residual values, acquisition fees, whatever, if I control the subvented programs. From a lending institution standpoint, it's very similar, a little bit different lens, but we're trying to influence your consumer behavior, right? So if we take the manufacturer and the lender as two pillars, right, and we take those offers that are going to influence your behavior, we have to accurately represent them to you, right? So the digital retailing technologies need to be able to provide you with the payments that the lending institution and the manufacturers want based on the analytics that they've done, including all the taxes and fees and all the rest of the stuff, right? The marketing companies need to be able to do the exact same thing because the marketing companies basically are driving them to the digital retailing companies, which in turn are driving them to the store, and the store needs to be able to replicate that transaction exactly. And everybody's trying to accomplish the exact same thing. And it's almost like imagine building a bridge from one side of a river to another side of the river, and if you're not communicating too well, you got a little bit of a mess. Well, this is like 5 bridges that are got to meet in the middle with a roundabout in it, right? And if everybody's building them and communicating along the way, then you're great. And if not, you got 5 bridges that are just launch ramps into the lake, right? You're gonna the ride up's pretty fun, but the end of the journey is not so good. And that's what we've seen time and time again in the market, where a customer gets engaged in a website and he's super excited about it. His payment's $300 a month, and he goes to take delivery of his vehicle, and he guess what? That's not exactly what it is. We're off the end of the ramp and we're into the lake, as opposed to whatever, because it's not $300, it's $400 a month, because the lending institutions did their job, the manufacturers did their job, but there was a disconnect between the technology company and the dealership, or the marketing company and the technology company, the dealership, or whatever. So everybody has to be singing off the same sheet of music.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned, municipality, because I would like to talk about, the types of federal and local government data that influences automotive retail transactions. For example, how does taxation and registration fees vary from state to state?
That's it varies wildly, right? I never ever talk politics at all when it comes to business, and I'm not going to on this call. I'm completely neutral, we'll say. But when you start looking at how municipalities calculate certain things, it's very clear that there were some bureaucrats that were involved with it, and none of them were mathematicians, right? So it is the most complex, convoluted, all over the map thing you have ever seen, if you only look at the registration fee calcs. And there's a few companies out there that have it right, and to get it right is a daunting task, right? You look at California, which is where we are. It varies from zip code to zip code, and it varies wildly, right? And it's based on the selling price of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, and then all these other goofy things, and they're expensive. Then you go to, I think it's Wisconsin or one of them, where it's based on taxable horsepower, and you got to know the bore, stroke, number of cylinders, and all that kind of stuff. Then you have all of the state and local taxation for lease, finance, balloon, cash purchase options, and those are all over the map as well. And some markets, there's 13 markets in the country that are super easy to understand because it's very black and white. California is one. Hey, we tax you on absolutely everything, right? But a bunch of the markets, there's discretionary ways that you might interpret the tax laws because they're a bit ambiguous. And some dealers will take a highly aggressive approach about how they interpret them. And then some dealers take a super conservative approach. Those two approaches generate different monthly payments. So, when we're trying to put together our programs for a lender or a manufacturer or a dealer, right, or a marketing company or a digital retailing company or whatever, when we're trying to influence the consumer behavior, we need to have a representative set of that class as well, that manufacturer or municipality class of data, because we want to make sure we're quoting you really what your payments are. So we need to know where you are, how that dealer is going to interpret those tax laws, and all that kind of stuff. It's very complex.
I mean, it sounds like it. I try and keep up with all the state regulations, and it's a nightmare. So I can imagine it's incredibly difficult for any lender to kind of keep that in line.
I used to have a ton of hair before we started tracking it, and now it's all gone. So,
well, that doesn't bode well for me, Rusty.
Sorry, man.
I already have a ton of gray.
Yeah. Well, rather gray and stay.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I'm for it. So, the selling dealer has to take all the compulsory data into account in calculating and presenting payments to a consumer. So what dealer-specific data comes into play in order to be able to transact?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we just touched on a little bit of it a minute ago with the municipality stuff, right? Which is, if I'm a dealer, how do I want taxes calculated, right? Because they've got to match what's going to come out of my CDK or rentals box or AutoSoft or whatever. Because when I generate the documents, it's got to be right. But there's a bunch of others, right? There's the different lending institutions that I have available for my customers, right? Maybe I only use my captive. Maybe I've got a relationship with U.S. Bank or Ally Financial, and they're really aggressive on certain vehicles in my inventory. And I want to be able to offer my customers cheaper monthly payments through those avenues. And then there's all of the other, I guess, terms and conditions under which I'm willing to transact that have to be taken into consideration as well, which is what fees do I charge, right? Do I charge a documentation fee? If I do, is that taxable? Yes or no? Where do I collect it on a lease? Do I collect it in the inception fees? Or do I collect it in the cap cost? Do I collect the tax on it in the cap cost or in the inception fees? All these little things that can influence how you end up as a consumer seeing the transaction, which is how much upfront, how much a month for how many months. And then it's all the rest of the stuff, right? Which is, do I have aftermarket products? Do I sell to have F&I products that I want to take into consideration that I can offer you? And you know how much they are, what they look like, that kind of stuff. Or maybe even like spray and bed liners. You know, if you're shopping online and you're looking at an F-150 truck and you want a spray and bed liner, you should be able to say, hey, I like this. I like that $410 a month payment. I'm okay with the upfront. What happens if I get a spray and bed liner? You know, and you should be able to say, I want the spray and bed liner. And they should be able to tell you, okay, Joey, it's going to cost you another $6 a month or whatever it is to have that spray and bed liner, nothing out of pocket or whatever. So all of those things I need to be able to set as well. And all of the terms and conditions under which me as a dealer, under which I'm willing to transact, need to be accurately represented and respected by everybody who's quoting payments on my behalf to my potential customers.
So, you talked a little bit about, digital marketing companies, technology companies. So I kind of want to punch in on that a little bit more. Technology companies, including digital marketing agencies, play an increasingly larger and important role in servicing the customer. So my question to you is, do these companies have specific data that is technology specific, or do they generally take all data from the other classes and include that in the offers and finance/lease payments they provide to the customer?
Both, right? It's unfortunate. Not everyone takes everything into consideration, right? We didn't really see that all that much before COVID, right? And all of us know that COVID has changed everybody's lives. I mean, it's changed the way we shop for everything. I don't want to say addicted to Amazon, but I'm very proficient with, okay, I need that, maybe it's something for my office, maybe it's whatever. Click, find, boom. I know exactly how much it's going to cost, buy it now, and the thing shows up the next day. And lo and behold, they charge my credit card exactly what they told me they were going to charge my credit card, right? So the different digital retailing companies that are out there are all kind of trying. They all exist in order to provide a better experience for the consumer, and one that drives the consumers through the process electronically into the dealership to take delivery of a vehicle. Right? Where we run into a bit of a challenge is not all of them are created equal, and not all of them take all of these different classes of data into consideration. The ones who do a great job, and dealers are very well represented. The CSI scores are high. Their grosses are higher because that level of trust is never lost, right? And then the digital retailing companies that don't take everything into consideration are realistically causing a big mess for the whole ecosystem. And there are some guys out there who are absolutely knocking it out of the park and getting everything right, and there are those who aren't. And the difficulty is that the consumer pays the price if he goes down the wrong path.
Mm-hmm. So, again, talking kind of about the consumer class of data, consumers' situation and circumstances obviously influence, a purchase or lease. So what factors and data are consumer specific?
So there's several, right? Obviously, it's, who are they and where are they, right? When we look at the consumer, the the different offerings that are available from the lending institutions and manufacturers are dictated by where the dealership resides and where the consumer is going to garage the vehicle. Right? So, which special programs are available to me depend on where I am, and then there's also a whole bunch of them that depend on who I am. Right? There's, we look at different rebates there, and there's how many billions of dollars of rebates that are available right now. I do know that as a nation, the manufacturers spend roughly $40 billion a year on rebates, and most of those fall into 5 categories, which are automatic ones that apply to everybody, or one of 4 super common conditionals, which are college grad, military, repeat customer loyalty, or conquest. But there's billions of dollars of other ones that don't always get taken advantage of. My favorite one, which they don't do anymore, but Chrysler used to have one that was called the National Funeral Directors Association, a $500 rebate if you were an undertaker. I was like, it was always a fun one to demo. But there's a ton of those out there, and they can't always be combined, so they have this stackability, if you will, terminology, because they're kind of like coupons for a grocery store. So we have to get those right. And then obviously, where you are is going to impact your taxes, your registration fees, all that kind of stuff as well. And then there's a whole nother big giant chunk of the transaction that's kind of the fuzzy stuff, which is credit related, right? So what's your credit profile look like, and the credit spectrum is all over the map, and the lending institutions spend a ton of time figuring out how best to analyze each individual consumer to kind of determine, okay, what's their risk, what's the risk reward, right? Is this going to make sense at this rate? If not, do we need a different rate? You get some guys who can walk in and they can get anything they want because they've never missed a payment on anything, and then you've got other ones who, especially through the pandemic, have had challenges, and they're maybe trying to rebuild their credit or whatever. And then you've got the guys who are like, I really want it, but I can't afford it, but I'm gonna try and get it anyway. So all the credit stuff comes into play, and then there's a ton of other stuff, but those are the big ones.
Mm-hmm. So, before we kind of like take a step back, you and I have talked about quite a bit, on this call. But I do want to ask you, Memorial Day weekend's coming up. Inventory is super tight. Like, what are your thoughts about the weekend?
It's going to be very telling, right?
Uh-huh.
I was talking to one of our large customers, right? We power a bunch of different technologies, and one of them is a big digital retailing company, and they're one of our largest customers. And we were kind of just catching up, right? Because he's also a good friend. And he says, it's super challenging right now because his customers are very low on inventory, right? And a year ago they were all griping that, hey, you know what? We got all these cars, and we got no customers. Can you help us out? Can you, maybe give us a discount for a few months while we get through this? And now they're all calling and saying, hey, we got all these customers, but we don't have any cars. So can you help us out, right? And the concept kind of circled back around to this may be the very best example of the application of the laws of supply and demand that our auto industry has ever seen. Right? I mean, it is both opposite ends of the spectrum in 1 year. Right? Tons of cars, no customers. Tons of customers, and lots of pent up excitement about, hey, things are opening up. I can go out. I can go into a dealership. I can go buy I can't. They don't have one. Right? So I think that volume is going to be pretty good. I think almost everything that these guys have on the ground might get sold. I think it's going to go for a premium. I think we're going to see a ton of used cars sold, that because the used car market's really, really hot right now. And I think it's going to be just a weekend, right? It's going to be a weekend where there's a lot of customers that want stuff that they can't get because it doesn't exist. There's a lot of customers who are going to end up buying stuff, and but it's I look at it's a great question. I'm sorry, I don't mean to ramble on,
Not at
but
all. Not at all.
but
Please.
everything that we're dealing with right now is a challenge, right? It's a problem, right? And every player in this space that approaches it as a let's find a solution, right? And when I say every player, lender, manufacturer, dealership, marketing company, technology company, everybody, right? If you look at everything that comes up that's super challenging as, okay, this is a problem and we need to try and figure out how to make the best of it. We need a solution for this problem. What is that solution for the problem? Those are the ones who are going to look back and say, that era really was a pain in the butt, but we learned from it, right? We improved, right? We can't change the fact that there's only a certain number of cars out there, right? But what we can do is we can figure out how do we make the best of it. And we do know that the market's going to correct, right? Things are going to happen, right? Cars are going to get built, and then everything's going to kind of normalize, right? Whatever that quote unquote new normal is. I hate that term because I've heard it too many times, but it's accurate, right? And we're going to go back to business, right? The question is what business are we going back to? Are we going back to what we used to do? Or are we going to come out of this thing running 1,000,000 miles an hour and slaying dragons? And I think that there's lending institutions, there's manufacturers, there's marketing companies, there's technology companies, and there's dealerships. They're going to fall into both buckets. They're going to be the guys who learned, evolved, and came out of it great. And they're going to be the ones who are, woe is me, this is terrible. Why is this happening to me? Why can't I get a break? And you know what? I hope they're few and far between. Most of the companies that we're seeing that are out there are, they're licking their wounds. All of us are, but we're all pushing to figure out, okay, how do we make this experience better for the consumer? Because when things do open up, we're going to be in a great position.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it just adds credence to, everything you and I have talked about today and the importance of data and, really kind of, using the insights that we have to, make the best of the situation we're in right now.
Yeah, no question. It's all, it sounds kind of goofy, but it's unity, right? We all have to have the same message. And, there's no magic to the message, right? Because there's only one accurate answer, right? This is the very best program that's available to Joey right now in the vehicle that he wants. And it represents accurately what the manufacturer is willing to do for Joey. It represents accurately what the lending institution is willing to do, and accurately represents what the taxes and fees are and what the dealership says he's willing to do, right? And that's all driven by a massive amount of data and the ability to make sense of it. But it's not magic, it's just difficult, right? And computers make difficult look like magic, right? And just tie it all together and everybody sings off the same sheet of music, if you will, and what do you know? It's Amazon, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's kind of look at the big picture and like take a step back, maybe try and make sense of all this. What kind of data are companies involved in retailing using today that's different from years ago?
A lot of the stuff that we talked about, right? And then maybe what's being presented to consumers, right? And how they're shopping, right? We look at the world from our lenses, right? And one of the things that we started doing a while back is we started tracking everything that comes into our ecosystem, right? And we're quoting, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 million payments a day, right? A lot of them are analytics, but a lot of them are consumer facing. So we started tracking all these that are coming in, and it gives us insight into what's being quoted to a consumer, what's the average MSRP on these vehicles based on these trims, what's the average selling price, average fees, rate markups, and that kind of stuff. And those types of analytics, and there's a whole bunch of companies that are out there that are doing all kinds of similar things, right? And every company that's tracking consumer behavior is doing it outside of the automotive market or automotive industry have been for years. But it gives us, it gives, I think, all the different players in the marketplace a little bit of insight into um, how do we uh, how do we influence consumer behavior in a manner that makes sense for all of us. All the other data that we talked about is static at any given time, right? The rates, the residuals, the taxes, the rebates, the incentives, and all that stuff at 11:38 today. Those numbers are those numbers. But what's being presented to me as a car buyer or you as a car buyer, that might be changing um, you know, every time a sales manager changes something on a desking tool and calculates a monthly payment. And it's kind of fun for us because we get to see those. So it gives us a little additional data, a little additional insight.
So I would imagine that data we have today is more accurate than it was, say, I don't know, 5 years ago. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, way more accurate. Not just the accuracy of the data, but the ability to get to it is better. There's more data than there was before. It's a little bit weird because there's not as many lending institutions as there once were, but there's much higher level of complexity amongst all the different offerings. Right? We look at Ally Financial is one of our fun ones. Right? We do a ton of work with those guys or gals, if you will. Aaron Klepaski over there is very forward thinking, and they come up with some crazy programs all the time. So they have a whole lot more programs than they used to have. Right? All of the lending institutions have kind of figured out how to get their messaging out there to a certain extent. Right? And I think now almost all of them have bought into the concept that if we want to earn certain business, we want to accurately be represented in the consumer's eyes, right? That whole shift from it's not how we see the outside world, it's how the outside world sees us. Mm-hmm. Well, if we don't tell the outside world what we have to offer, the outside world can't see us, right? So they're being better about sharing their data, and some of them even about getting their data out ahead of launch, right? It's important that whatever technology company they work with says, okay, look, we're not going to tell the world what you're doing until its effective date, but let's get it in as early as we can. That way, when that special does hit the street, you're able to get it in front of as many consumers as possible and get it accurately represented. The dealerships are starting to come around that way as well. Before the pandemic, every dealer's like, we don't want to quote anything online. And now it's like, okay, if we don't quote anything online, we're not getting any business. So we got to figure out how do we quote stuff online. We have to share that type of information as well. Municipality stuff is municipality stuff. It's public, so that's not too tough. But the only holdout is the manufacturers, and they're starting to come around as well. So access to the data is better, and then I think all of the players in the space have continued to evolve the manner in which they aggregate, ingest, and organize this data. I know that's been our biggest focus for 33 years is improving that process, and we've been doing that. And then what's really made it fun is you have all this data, right? And we kind of have a saying around here, big data without science is just noise, right? You can have a ton of this data, but if you can't make sense of any of it, all you've done is spend a lot of money figuring out how do I get all this chunk of data in here. And with the rapid growth of cloud services and cloud computing, it's changed the world for us. We're able to calculate ridiculous amounts of payments for not too much money now that 5 years ago would have been impossible. We had a record day this month where we calculated just a hair over 1 billion payments in one day with a B. And I was like, this can't be right. And then we start looking and say, well, we've got some customers who use our analytics tools to run a lot of stuff, right? So they weren't consumer facing, obviously. You're never going to have 1 billion payments in a day. I mean, it'd be nice if you did, but 1 billion payments that one company calculates in a day to go after, consumers. There's just not that many people shopping for cars in that day. But, to do that 5 years ago, if it was possible, I can't imagine how much you would have to spend in order to make that happen. And for us, it was, it was just a cool statistic and a cool chart on the monitor. But, Now data's available. We're able to track it accurately, and thanks to ridiculous cloud computing power that's very affordable, we're able to make sense of it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, that segues nicely into my final question. Obviously, great strides have been made, in the industry over, the past year. What sort of improvements do we need to look forward to, kind of going forward?
I think continued effort on the same focus, right? Which is we have to accurately represent every player in the space, which is every one of these classes that we spoke about. We have to accurately represent them every step of the way. And all of us are working towards that. And then, from a kind of next steps thing is when we can tie all this ecosystem together, which hopefully that happens sooner rather than later, how do we really shake things up, right? Our life is, okay, let's look and see what's the next big problem that exists out there. And maybe it's a problem that people aren't aware of. How do we solve it? So we have this kind of discover, solve, expose approach, right? Try to discover a problem, solve the problem, and then expose the problem. And we call it Willy Wonka's disease here, right? You say, Joey, you got Willy Wonka's disease. Well, what is it? Well, you didn't know you had it, but if you don't take this pill, you're going to die, and you're interested in the pill, right? They're not that simple, right? But I think that almost everybody in the space is starting to adopt that type of philosophy, which is we now know that we can evolve much more rapidly than we ever thought possible. And a lot of technology companies and manufacturers and lending institutions are out there trying to evolve the process to improve the consumer experience. And, if we all start, I think, maybe working together a little closer and a little more open and a little better, I think that that's the next big thing for the industry.
All right. Well, Rusty, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today. Next month's Industry Pulse will feature Mark Edelman from McGlinchey, and Rusty will return again in November for his third appearance on the Industry Pulse. To all our viewers, we'd love to hear from you. What market trends are you most interested in? Shoot us an email at info@autofinancenews.net. And as always, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again, Joey, for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Always.